Please join us in welcoming Mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, United States, Daniel Rickenmann, and founder of Smart City Policy Group, Matt Curtis, in conversation with Skift Editor-in-Chief, Sarah Kopit.
Mr. Mayor, Matt, thank you so much for being here today to have this conversation about regulation. We just heard Dennis talk about it. I think for a maturing industry like short-term rentals, regulation is the conversation to have right now. So I've done a little bit of reporting, and I have talked to a lot of homeowners about home prices, availability. They're kind of furious. There's a lot of anger out there about how expensive housing is, how there isn't enough housing for people that aren't wealthy. And a lot of them blame short-term rentals for this. They see professional property managers coming in, buying 3, 4, 5, 6 houses in a neighborhood. 2 questions. Is that fair? And can regulation help?
Well, I would tell you that I think it's an unfair argument.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, long-term rental is the biggest competitor out there for housing, but it's also filling a housing need. So the argument's there. Then there was, short-term rental argument. Oh, they're taking housing off the market, and then these outside investors are buying up houses. Yeah. But the reality is that's not true. The reason that we're having the housing issue we're having now is the cost of, just the regulation cost to build a house has made it unaffordable. Zoning, we went through a period, especially in our community, where everything was single-family homes. But yet in today's market, we know that 85% of our future needs are all for baby boomers who are downsizing, single moms with no kids at home, and younger generations that aren't interested in home ownership. So they want quadruplexes, townhomes, condominiums, duplexes. So changing our zoning. So it's really, to me, it's a regulation issue and a cost. And obviously, where mortgage rates are today plays a big role into that.
One thing you said was about property managers buying homes, and that so rarely ever happens. I mean, they're managing homes that are owned by someone else. But the listings and how so many different communities in our 23,000 local governments in America, how they are looking at the listings is what's confusing the everyday property owner in a community. And they're sitting there and they're seeing a manager who might have dozens of properties listed on their site. They think that property manager owns those properties, and they have taken those properties off the market, and that's just not the case. So often, anyway.
Yeah.
But the thing when we look at housing studies, which we produce, and we've done some international, but mostly in the United States, is it never equates to an issue with the local attainability, affordability of properties in a community. What we have is we lost the direction in our community of really focusing on having a mix of missing middle and attainable housing, and then focusing on partnerships for workforce and true affordable housing. And that takes real partnership with a community to build, and we just weren't doing that for a long time. And of course, the biggest reason I think Mayor Rickenmann highlighted, and then President Obama, at the end of his term, actually put out a paper on this, that most American cities had not changed their land use practices in 60 years. So they had really old, outdated land use codes. So they're building single-family property next to single-family property, where what they need to do is, even in our vacation communities, look at a new type of housing that includes more density and more walkability.
Yeah, I took a road trip to Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago for a soccer tournament, and there were a couple of those in rural Pennsylvania. You go and there's a housing, like a subdivision, but a bunch of sidewalks with stores in it. I was like, this is new. Like, this is a new kind of land use that they're doing there. So that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, that new urbanist model that so many communities are embracing, where you're providing greater walkability. It really adds so much to the community, but also to the happiness factor of everyday citizens, and they're able to walk and enjoy life. Now, it's not for absolutely everyone, but it's such a great way to pursue building new and affordable types of housing. And it's just one of the different tools that we have. But one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit is for those communities that are pointing at short-term rentals as being the reason for the lack of affordable, attainable housing.
Yeah.
There's just no there, and they're wasting time by having that argument, because they should be focused on creating real solutions.
And the funny part about that is when you point and you point at an industry, but the
Yeah.
reality is we started gridding out our city to look at where are all the empty lots, where are all the opportunities. When you weigh the amount of opportunities that go against even the rental market, you're going, this is not true. You know, this is simply the math doesn't add up. It is upon us to make sure that we can regulate the higher density, you know, being able to find the right places that we can do multi-level, that you can build these condos or townhomes or whatever is needed in these areas. But when you look at it, I would say that probably 5% of the rental community you could argue is a part of that based on where they are. But when you look at the availability of land and opportunity, smart growth and thinking, and we went away from density. You look back at after World War II, what did everybody build? They built density. Then we went away from that, and now we're going back to it because the walkability, the socialization. It's proven that in these communities where you have the walkability, you have higher density, more socialization creates longer life. So, I mean, it's a balance.
So I just recently wrote a piece for Skift about the tensions between neighbors in residential communities. It's not the beach communities, not the the tourist communities. This is in like subdivisions where people typically buy single-family homes to raise their kids, and now when Airbnb or any other short-term rentals come in, they have a villain, right? There's a real clash between neighbors that are going on there. And it's spilling over into city council meetings, which is creating regulation. Our last guest was talking about how we have all these, literal thousands of different ways that each single community is choosing to either regulate or not short-term rentals. I'm curious what you both think about whether these communities or the government in general should even have the right to regulate short-term rentals, and if so, kind of have you seen anybody do it correctly other than possibly where you are, Mr. Mayor, who I assume you've done it perfectly?
Well, I wouldn't say we've done it perfectly, but it brought up an issue. A couple things. Number one is it is a business.
Yeah.
So regulating it the smart way, we require a registration, so we know who the point of contact is. We require it to be a safe environment that's up to regulation, so you can't just, turn a dump into a vacation home. You really have to have it built up. We make sure that they keep records so that because for a period of time, we weren't getting any of the fees that were being collected. I mean, we were back owed millions of dollars in fees as a community, so we're like, well, look, if we're doing this is an industry, this is a business, so let's regulate for that way. What we didn't do is create a moratorium. What we didn't do is take it away. And there is efforts from community members to take it away from neighborhoods. But I will tell you, I think it enhances our neighborhoods. It creates a lot of jobs. That if you look at our short-term rentals, they are taking the quality of the properties, the way the yard maintenance, everything, the code, they have very little violations, very little, compared to homeowners and long-term rentals who in a neighborhood actually have more problems. But there was a big push to take it away. And there still is by some neighborhoods saying, it takes away from the historic character. It destroys our neighborhood. We're going to get outvoted when it comes to our neighborhood meetings. All of our false narratives. It's this fear of the unknown. And it's almost like they want to create a problem so they can give a solution. It's interesting, but we were able to oversee that. But what we also saw is that the market kind of levelized out as well. There wasn't this angst that it's going away. But for us, for community members with the South, especially South Carolina is the second largest growing state in the Southeast. People are moving there. I've met more people who have rented in different neighborhoods before they bought. So they could figure out, they wanted to understand the walkability. What's the stores like, and what are my neighbors like? Can my kids walk to school? How close are the parks? How convenient is it? But then we also saw the other part is we have the largest training base in the Southeast at Fort Jackson. Well, military families have very little time to spend with their graduate average stay is 4 days in our community. Well, as a family, they're embracing our community. They're doing more things. We've seen an uptick in museum visits, zoo visits, dining out, etc., because they're staying in a short-term rental because they're together. Or in a hotel, it was interesting is we didn't see the same amount of growth across our different, it had such a big economic impact.
And I would just add that I think local governments are always going to have the power to control local zoning. And even in the couple of states where we've seen statewide preemption pass, it's barely hanging on in Florida and Arizona. After 4 attempts to pass statewide preemption in Texas to do something that would maybe poke the eye of cities, after 4 attempts, it still didn't pass out of the first committee. So I think there's really little appetite for the state preemption model, and we will continue to see this regulated at local government levels.
So what do you think happened in New York City, and do you think it's been successful?
No. I think one of the things, in fact, if we could maybe slide over to the next slide here, maybe we can come back to this, but you have a thing called a cost of compliance.
Yeah.
What does it cost to enforce local regulations? And the cost can be extraordinary. So you see a few cities where they've done it well, and they actually have a reasonable cost of compliance, so reasonable regulations, and they are able to achieve it for a reasonable amount. New York is not only spending so much to chase after this black market that they've created by driving the activity underground, but that's going to continue to grow.
I was going to say, nobody loves a black market more than New Yorkers, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like if anyone kind of knows how to play this game, we do.
What's so sad about this is I think so many people in the room, and Carl and I know John Suzuki. I remember when John Suzuki came to New York with his entire family. They checked into a black market short-term rental, not knowing that it was black market. And shortly after getting in there, a code compliance officer showed up and asked them to leave. Now, not only was there were probably dozens and hundreds of other black market short-term rentals being rented out that same evening, but you're spending a lot on the code enforcement officer, but you're also creating a terrible experience for John and his family, where they say, you know what, we're not going to go back to New York for as long. Now, can New York create regulations that can be achieved and achieve those local goals? I think they can, and they can do it for a reasonable level like some other communities did, like North Myrtle Beach or Glenn County.
You have any thoughts on New York? I love talking about this in New York because it's my backyard.
It's funny. My oldest daughter lives here, and we kind of laugh about the black market here in New York, especially because you look at when they went to regulate marijuana shops. There are more illegal marijuana shops than there are legal, and they can't keep up with. I think it's going to be the same thing. It's just driving it under, and it's going to exist. So why not sit down with folks and figure out a way to make this work? It doesn't have to be that complicated. I mean, our registration fee for us is like $200. That's it. Yeah. There's a way to do it that you bring everybody to the table, and it's not complicated. But I do think it enhances people's stay, and I think you're exactly right. The worst thing that you can happen is have a series of tourists who come to the city and like, well, I'm going to choose. There are other cities. I can go to Chicago. I can go to Boston. I can go to Miami. I can go other places. And you miss out on that experience.
Not only are there other cities, but in most destinations there are other cities a short drive away. And so for what we've seen happen in New York City is such a growth of activity in North Jersey and around the greater New York area, where so tax dollars are being spent in other communities. New York is missing out on that. People are having great experiences in other communities, and New York is missing out on the economic activity.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up some of the data, and I'm curious what both of your experiences is with looking at the data, and we can talk about anecdotes, all we want, but I'm curious what the data has actually said about how regulation affects short-term rentals, like brass tacks. What are the numbers? What have both of you seen when you've looked at that?
Can we hop in?
Yeah.
So just real quick, I love the 2 examples that we have, which is Glenn County and Palm Desert. La Quinta had a similar story as well, Telluride not far behind, where after putting together some regulation and tracking the complaints, they were expecting an extraordinary number of complaints based on all the anecdotal stories about that house has parties all the time. Things you're not supposed to say in couples therapy, right? You're not supposed to say all the time, and you shouldn't say all the time at City Hall either. Well, it turns out that after beginning to track those complaint calls and really doing a deep dive, having a 24-hour call number and other things like that, those communities didn't see the number of valid complaints. The number one complaint in Palm Desert was unfounded complaint. And the number two complaint was the owner calling to say my trash hadn't gotten picked up. Glenn County had put together a presentation and a proposal when they passed their ordinance saying that they would use their registration fee to hire 3 new code enforcement officers. They have about 4,000 short-term rentals. So between their existing staff and 3 new code enforcement officers, they thought they could deal with the regulations in that community. After a year of tracking the data, they were seeing about 12 valid complaint calls a week, and they realized that they couldn't justify hiring 3 code enforcement officers for this task. And so they had to go back and do some community engagement and talk to the community about changing how they were going to use that registration fee. That's a story we see often when we look at data. We see a tremendous economic impact from the activity. We see a tremendous cost of compliance if a community overregulates, and we don't see the number of complaints that so many folks talk about.
We've been tracking it for the last year since we put into regulations. And part of what we committed to the community is let's track it. And if there's a problem, we'll address it. I mean, and what I found about short-term rentals, a lot of short-term rentals regulate themselves. I mean, if you have a bad client, you're going to post that, and they're not going to get picked up by somebody else. So there's a lot of self there. But when we looked at the numbers, I mean, the biggest complaints that came out, and they were very few. There were actually more for homeowners and more for long-term rentals than there were the short-term. But it was things like the Herbie Kirby was not pulled back. You know, a neighbor complained about that. Or there were too many cars parked in my space. It's a public street. You know?
Right.
You know, this isn't your space. It's public. It just didn't justify it. And so when we look at it, we're going, that's not there. The data does not support that it's reflecting. And then the other point is that it's bringing down the values in our home. Well, it was very interesting. We went back and looked at a 5-year take back from 2019 up, and we saw that most of the neighborhoods where the loudest voices were their home value was up 48%.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of data, one issue we were talking about earlier, which is bans and moratoriums and overregulation, we have not seen a single community create more affordable, attainable, or workforce housing by banning or restricting short-term rentals. Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a couple questions from the audience. So anyone who has questions for the mayor or Matt, send them on in. Can you share your thoughts on investment companies like Blackstone buying up homes for rental purposes? I think this is where a lot of the kind of the nature of the complaint, when they think that you've got maybe not the property managers, but big out-of-state companies, scary New York City people in high-rises coming in to buy up single-family homes. Should they be regulated differently or at all?
That's a really tough one. I mean, my biggest thing that I always fall back on is in so many of these communities where the amount of housing capacity, housing inventory is so lean, they need to be focused on building more of that. So it's almost a non-answer, I know, but I kind of go back to if the concern is about, and it typically is, that missing middle workforce and attainable housing market, then the communities need to be focused more on creating those partnerships to create more of those types of properties. I haven't really landed on this one. This is interesting. I mean, I know it's got to scare some people, and I think in 23,000 local governments around the country, it probably doesn't happen as often as people think. In fact, I know it doesn't.
I think since COVID, I think the last 2 years, you've seen that really. In the beginning, I think you saw a lot of it, and it scared communities because people were buying houses left and right. There were realtors that were working strictly for major corporations buying across, and I think some of that's weaned. We have even seen some of these houses come back on the market. Yeah. They're starting to get out of that investment. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It's more of a myth than it is a reality. In some communities, in some places, it may be bigger. We just haven't experienced it like that.
So I really like this question. This one's for you, Mr. Mayor. Can you share your thoughts on? Sorry, wrong one. Local governments tend to copy and paste bad regulations. I want to know if you agree with that. But can you help other local governments copy and paste better regulations?
I'll tell you, the person who's helped local governments more than any individual is a New Yorker named Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg
old
has
boss.
spent more money investing in helping local governments make changes, but positive changes and best practices by bringing us together as mayors and our staffs and training them and showing them how to take. People do, but what we've tried to get away, and this is what a lot of our staff has had the ability to learn through the Bloomberg Harvard program, is using data, not emotion. You know, and if you look at a lot of the bad policies we're talking about, they've been made by emotion, and it's usually by 25 people or 50 people that have been but we call them cave people, citizens against virtually everything. And it's the best term I ever heard, because it really describes it. It doesn't matter what it is. They all want everything, but they don't want anything, especially in their backyard. And so I think a lot of bad policy has been driven by this handful of people. And when you can get over that stage, that changes it, and you make it about data. It's just like the short-term rental. We're getting ready to come up on our year, and when we share the information of it, it's going to dispel so much of the falsehoods that are being spread into neighborhoods being attacked and, you know, party houses, as you mentioned. Yes, does that happen? Of course it does. But I mean, when you look at the percentage, it's no different than one of your local kids having a party when his parents are out of town. I mean, it's literally the numbers are that low. So I think from a policy standpoint, it really is about making it focused on facts and figures and not so much on emotion.
You know, we have a question about, is it the hotel lobby? You know, in all these years, and Carl and I first started doing this 15 years ago, it's almost never been the hotel lobby. And so I think it's important to know, what are we, you know, addressing here? Where's the source of this? I know so many people have to think, oh, of course it's the hotel lobby. There was a time, I think, one of our larger hotel chains had total in the United States 3 government affairs members of their team. There's 23,000 local governments in America. Those 3 guys weren't dealing with, you know, creating all these thousands of short-term rental regulatory discussions. It is almost always, 99.9% of the time, whether it's the Canary Islands or Aruba or Lincoln County, Oregon, not in my backyard, or kind of cave community. And so often a group of people who say they're more than happy to use short-term rentals when they travel anywhere else, they just don't want them in their community. So I think, you know, to the mayor's points, we have to embrace the fact that they do have emotions, and we do have to hear them, and we do have to address them, but then we have to have a conversation that's about policy creation that works and based in data.
What do you think? Last question. What's your crystal ball? Like, how do you think the next 3 years are going to go for short-term rentals in the regulation space? What do you think the trend is going to be moving forward?
I think it's going to continue to grow. I think the demand is there. People like that experience, and I think it's beneficial to the communities. I think hoteliers and other folks are embracing it because they also benefit our community. The fees we collect actually help promote the community, which gets them more rooms too.
Yeah.
And we had a great crystal ball because neither of us talked to one another this morning and wore the same thing. So we know what we're doing. One thing that I would just simply add, and as the mayor said, you know, it's going to continue to grow, is I think every time there's a new city council member, a new county attorney, a new city manager, the conversations in these communities are going to potentially change, and the dynamics are going to change. So I have a feeling the short-term rental regulatory discussion will always be with us. I think it'll level, and we'll be talking about tweaking it a little bit this way and that. And I think the really smart thing we're going to see, and we're already seeing it from so many of America's mayors and other local leaders, is how we're having a real discussion to make effective housing policy to create the housing needs that our community are calling for.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.